Throughout history, humanity has devised countless gruesome methods to kill its enemies and enforce obedience through terror. Among the most shocking of these is blowing from a cannon, a form of execution that is almost inconceivable in its brutality. Used primarily by colonial powers, especially the British in India, this method involved tying a condemned person directly to the mouth of a loaded cannon. When fired, the victim's body would be instantly obliterated, torn apart by explosive force, limbs catapulted across the execution ground, leaving only blood and fragments. While it might appear as a relatively quick death by modern standards, blowing from a cannon was far worse than most imagine. It wasn't just a method of killing, it was a terrifying tool of psychological warfare, cultural humiliation, and public deterrence. In this video we explore the origins of this execution method, the way it was used, and why it appears much more horrifying than it initially indicates. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Blowing from a cannon has its roots in Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent, particularly in the Mughal Empire. It was reportedly used in the 16th and 17th centuries by Mughal leaders, and later adopted and refined by colonial powers, particularly the British Raj. For the Mughals, it served as a dual purpose: swift execution and dramatic display. The use of cannon fire rendered the body unrecognisable, preventing burial rites that were central to many religious traditions. The British, recognising this cultural impact, made strategic use of it. For Hindus, whose beliefs often require the body to be cremated whole for the soul to pass on, or for Muslims who require the body to be buried intact, this destruction of the body was more than just a physical death. It was, in a sense, spiritual annihilation. The method wasn't only a punishment for rebellion, but a deliberate desecration of belief and tradition. The most infamous use of the execution method came during the Indian Rebellion of 1857, also known as the First War of Indian Independence. The uprising, fuelled by resentment towards British economic policies, cultural insensitivity, and military practices, was brutally suppressed. The British response to the rebellion was calculated, theatrical, and terrifying, and blowing from a cannon was central to that strategy. Captured rebels, especially sepoys, Indian soldiers who were within the British Army, were often sentenced to this gruesome death. Public executions were staged to instill fear and discourage others from joining the cause. Large crowds were forced to watch as bound prisoners were lashed to the muzzles of cannons, often with their backs facing the weapon. When the cannon was fired, the result was horrifying. The torso might be vaporized, while limbs, head, and organs were hurled dozens of feet in all different directions. Blood and flesh would rain down on spectators, many of whom were deliberately gathered to witness the British display of power. These weren't quiet, peaceful, private executions. British officers and colonial administrators documented them, and some even posed for photographs near to cannons after the executions. In some cases, the cannon crews were Indian themselves, forced to fire upon their fellow countrymen under orders. The aim was to destroy not just the body of the rebel, but the morale and cultural unity of the entire population. Now, why was this method worse than you'd think? For one, it was not just the act of killing, it was the manner of the killing, the location, the audience, and the symbolism. Death by hanging or shooting, while brutal, often leaves the body largely intact. The victim retains their physical identity in death. But blowing from a cannon made the body vanish in an instant. There was no funeral, no remains to bury, no last rites, no closure. In some accounts, witnesses described the terror in the eyes of the condemned as they were dragged to the cannon. Others, forced to clean up the remains afterwards, reported finding bones embedded in nearby walls or scattered across trees. Soldiers described the sound as deafening, and the aftermath as a blood-soaked nightmare. For religious Hindus, the obliteration of the body meant that the soul might wander endlessly in torment, unable to reincarnate. For Muslims, it meant a denial of a proper burial and judgment in the afterlife. The British, aware of these spiritual beliefs, used the method because of the added psychological cruelty. It wasn't enough to just kill the rebel, they had to destroy his identity, soul, and also legacy. Accounts from the time show how important the theatrical element of the executions was. The British used cannons placed in open squares, with villagers and townspeople forced to gather and watch. Children were sometimes present too. In these settings, blowing from a cannon wasn't just a punishment, it was a public exhibition designed to etch fear into memory. Some reports claim that the British would execute multiple prisoners at once, using a line of cannons to fire in unison. The noise, the sudden spray of blood and viscera, and the sudden silence that followed created a lasting impression on all those who witnessed it. Even today, this concept provokes horror. In modern media and historical texts, it's often included on lists of the most terrifying execution methods ever deployed or used in history, but few understand how calculated and culturally devastating it truly was. By the late 19th century, as colonial powers became more sensitive to global scrutiny and ideas of human rights began to gain traction, the use of such executions declined. However, the memory of blowing from a cannon lingered. It remains one of the most horrifying symbols of colonial repression in India, a method remembered not just for its gore, but for its utter disregard for human dignity. In Indian literature, art, and oral history, the method has become a symbol of martyrdom and suffering. Statues and memorials commemorate the rebels who were killed in such gruesome fashion, and modern historians have studied the psychological warfare waged by such punishments. Blowing from a cannon is more than a macabre footnote in history. It's a powerful reminder of how execution can be wielded not just as a tool of death, but as an instrument of cultural destruction. Far worse than a quick end, it robbed its victims of identity, of funeral rites, and of humanity. It turned death into an absolute, public, horrific spectacle, and turned suffering into a warning, and brutality into a state-sanctioned message. It was not just an execution. Blowing from a cannon was an annihilation. And if I'm honest, that's why it's worse than you'd think, because it wasn't just physical. The impact on the people who saw it was horrific. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.